So this afternoon's first speaker, and I must get this right, her name is Claudia Roodt. And Claudia is a motivational speaker, a trauma-informed therapist, and a facilitator as well as a social worker. Now that's a mouthful, Claudia, but we really believe that you are here because you want to share with us and encourage us. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon, and let's give Claudia a big round of applause. Thank you.
How do I get to mine? Hi, good afternoon. I don't know if I will be able to give you all the, she said she wants to know how to deal with all the trauma, but I'm going to try my best. So I'm a social worker for 30 years. And I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of my own story, because that sparked my own research that I've done in trauma. But I think before I want to do that, I want you to, just for a minute, think, who's that person that you felt safe with in your life? If you can think back as far as you can. Who's that person that made you feel safe? I hear some say mum. Who else? Father, brother? Teacher? That's great. So I'm the youngest of 3 sisters. I grew up in a little town, Citrusdal. It's about an hour and a half's drive from here. And I grew up in a very performance-driven home. My father was a lawyer, and he believed that the only thing that matters was academical performances. Now at that stage, as a little girl that was born in 1966, I had no idea why this is. For me, I've been interested in relationships since I can remember. I just wanted to speak to everyone, get to know everyone, play with everyone, and my family was all but that. I've got 2 older sisters who's quite a bit older than me. And it's only years later that I understand. My father was born on a farm there, and his father was an alcoholic. And my father's dream has been to become a lawyer. But his father couldn't afford to go and send him off to study. So his father went to one of the affluent farmers and asked to pay for my dad's studies. And this gentleman said, no, if we must pay for all the poor farmers' children to go and study, who's going to look after the animals? So after matric, my dad had to go and work first to earn money to pay for his own studies. So his mission in life almost was that he will pay for his children's tuition after school, but that we had to show that we deserve it, and we had to get full marks. So nothing but first in the class was good enough for him. My mother, on the other hand, was the eldest of 14 children. And they grew up in Uppington, Kanoneland, and there was also no money for her to go and study. So an aunt paid for her to go and do a course in accounting in Paarl. And she made a pact with herself that she will never be poor again. So she and my father got together. She worked in his lawyer's office, and it was a disaster to happen. Because their intention was not there to harm their children. But there was no relationships in our home, none. And that set the trajectory of my life. That set me living in a fear-driven environment where the only thing that was focused on was our academics. And then when I was in grade 7, my father had an affair with someone else. And I managed to always be sort of amongst the first 3 in the class, but that year, because it's a small town, he was a lawyer there, and you don't speak about those things. And I sort of hid myself away in my bedroom. My sisters have then gone to varsity already, and my grades just dropped. like someone that like skydived. And that year I didn't get any prize, grade 7. And I remember that my father, the night of the prize giving, looked at me and he said to me, "Oh, he's so ashamed, and as far as he's concerned, I don't exist anymore." And I can recall how I felt that I became two people. And that set the scene for me to then dive into survival mode. And in order for me to stand here where I am today and to survive the next, I'm now 53, so the next 41 years, I literally had to adopt survival skills because I had no one in my family I could turn to. Besides, our domestic worker was the person I felt safe with. Now, if you take anything from trauma today away, I want you to take away a bit of my story, that she was the reason that I could build a bit of resilience. Because with her, I felt safe. I felt safe and protected from all this stuff that was happening, and no one that came and buffeted me against the stress. So as you are sitting here, you've got children that come into your class, and you have got no idea what's happening when they make that transition in the morning from home to your school. And we want to think that that child that comes in here is ready for education. But I can tell you now that 95% of your learners is not. Because they make that transition with that trauma in their nervous system. And I will explain to you that trauma doesn't sit in the part of your brain that's responsible for learning, but that part of your brain that you need for them to be online, that part shuts down when you experience trauma. So that child comes and sits in your class in a survival mode. And all they need is actually that safe space. We are living in one of the most stressful times in our history. And this is having an impact on our children and our youth. The level of stressful experiences many of our learners go through even before they enter into the academic careers is on the rise. I work with educators in Lavender Hill, that's from EduCares, and I hear the trauma that those small children experience already in the environment and at home. And not only at home, but also in the communities where they come from. Their brains are wired for fear. And their perception of how they fit into the world is fear-based. Because all of you, as you sit here, has experienced one or more stressful events. But how you rise and how you become resilient depends on the amount of people that's there to support you. Nothing else. There's no magic wand today that I'm going to give you on how to deal with trauma. It's scientifically proven that the best way to help someone to deal with trauma is through a safe relationship. We can no longer ask our learners to change to fit their environment because it's simply not working. It's time to change the environment for our learners. So I normally start off with this, and I say that in your school you can have two learners, and we're going to call them Andy and Billy. And who are they? So Andy is the learner who grew up in a loving, nurturing, stable and predictable home with positive and emotional secure experiences. And one of the things that you as educators need to hear me today is one of the things that children that experience trauma still on a daily basis in their communities and homes need more than anything besides a safe relationship is predictability. He begins his school career ready to learn. His early childhood experiences have prepared him to be able to focus. Now, if you think of some of the children that you have, probably 95 of the children that you have, when they come to school, how ready are they to learn? How ready are they to sit and concentrate? Andy has a well-developed regulatory system and can handle the stress and demands of the academic environment. You can only be able to do that when you've had a good relationship with your first caregiver where that co-regulation happens. No child walks into a school environment and is immediately ready to academically learn. Andy's natural love for learning is intact, and his sense of curiosity is ever expanding. But here's the child that needs your attention. Billy is the learner who has had adverse childhood experiences, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, in the past or present or both. And I want you to hold on to the word adverse childhood experiences and ask yourself, what is adverse childhood experiences? Because in the trauma circles they might say, yeah, it's not when the child fails the test. I disagree. If you have a home where that is the only thing that's spoken about, that is an adverse childhood experience. Billy is a learner who shows up at school in a high stress state, unable to focus and unmotivated. He is the learner who either overreacts to small and inconsequential situations or completely shuts down and disconnects. Because often we think that the child that actually is quiet in the class is okay, but that might be the child that actually disconnects. Billy is the learner who continues to challenge a school's disciplinary policies, as he does not only respond positively to punishment, but he continues to get worse. Additionally, Billy is the learner who does not even respond to positive reward systems. They too seem to only keep Billy spiraling downward. Billy is the learner who challenges each one of us to rethink the meaning of relationships, connection, and love. And I really want you to hear me today that a part of trauma-informed work and trauma-informed schooling is that we need to move from curriculum-based work to relationship-based work. And I hear your heart. Last night I was at a meeting again where two educators were complaining about the pressure of the Western Cape Education Department on them. And they are in the Kensington area where the teacher already had to dodge for bullets. But unless we are going to start changing the system, we're not going to reach our children that experience trauma on a daily basis. Billy is also the learner who will move us to a higher order of love. Now imagine that you walk in a forest and there's a bear, a grizzly bear, which you won't really see in South Africa, but it's a bear that comes after you, and you get that physical experience of how you get your nervous system get aroused and you're scared and you start running and your heart starts pumping and your whole body starts working to get away. But that's all fair and well if you're in the forest and that's the bear. But the children that we're talking about in trauma, that bear is tonight at home when that child is there. And children are automatically wired, I know I was, to be disrespectful and honoring to their parents. But if that's the one that's the bear every day that put you in danger and make you fear-based, that's very difficult then to make that transition in the morning to come to school and be able here to concentrate. So high doses of adversity not only affect the brain structure and function, they affect the developed immune system, the hormonal system, and even the way that our DNA is read and transcribed. if a baby cries and the mother ignores the cry, which is where the first trust cycle starts, our brains and our bodies are made to protect us and for us to go in survival mode. But we are not meant to know how to regulate our needs, our impulses in the beginning. So if that baby is not picked up, if that child's needs are not seen to, there's an over-secretion of the hormone called cortisol, and that child goes into survival mode. Now, if that child is not going to be soothed by an adult, if there's now a small child that comes here and they fall, someone is going to go and pick the child up and soothe them. But with children that's experiencing trauma, especially at home, and normally that comes from the caregiver, there's not another caregiver that go and pick that child up and soothe so that the nervous system can regulate itself again. So that child comes to your school tomorrow morning still in that high aroused state. Now, our brain is a social organ. I'm going to go to there. That's how your brain looks like. And it's only the bottom part of your brain that's fully developed when you're born. That's the part that the baby cries when it's hungry, he cries when it's wet, he cries when he wants to fall asleep. But that's it. So for people to say when a little child walks here, oh, it's in his genes, oh, he's like his mother or his father, that's actually not true. They have discovered in science that nurture over nature. So what we put into our children is actually what we see. So a child's brain, and as you sit here, your brains have developed in relation to the relationships and the caregivers and teachers that you had in your life. And that is crucial for you to understand, because each of you have still got an impact to make on that children that you teach, because the brain is like plastic, it's malleable, it can still be transformed and changed. However, what happens is, I'll get to that later. Let me just go back to that slide. So the middle part of the brain is the part where your emotions and your relationships are. And then the top part of your brain is the part that develops last. That's the front part of the brain that you need for children to be online. That's the part that you need for them to make decisions where learning happens. But that's also the part where curiosity lies. And that's the part where the regulation of their emotions lie. Now, all of us need the following. All of us need these 6 core strengths in order for us to develop in healthy human beings, and they start from the bottom upwards. And nowhere in there can you see, do they talk anything about your cognitive ability? I recently went with one of my clients to a what I thought was a forward-thinking school in Cape Town, and the little girl is 5 years old. Parents is going through quite a messy divorce. And she was a prem baby. But however, the teacher was only concerned about the fact that this child is not reaching the cognitive abilities for her to go to grade 1 next year. There was no mention of how she interacts with the other kids, what is her relationships, building skills like, nothing. So I want you to, while you see these slides, think about children that you deal with on a daily basis, if any of them have had a good attachment with a caregiver. Because let me tell you why that's so important. Your attachment with your caregiver and how that caregiver responds to your needs set a blueprint in your brain, and that blueprint is how you then deal with the rest of the world. So if your caregiver is aggressive or absent, that's how your brain going to perceive that the world is either available for you or not. So we can't say to children, haven't you been told this at home? Unless you know if the child had these 6 core strengths developed in their life. Now, in the 90s, in America, they did what they call the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And what this was, they questioned 17,000 middle-class Americans on adverse childhood experiences that they might have experienced between the ages of 0 to 18. And they found that there was a direct correlation between whether you've experienced one of those or more of those adverse experiences and health impacts later in life, negative health impacts and behavior impacts later in life. And what was these questions about? Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, loss of a parent, witnessing family violence, incarceration of a family member, having a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal family member, and living with a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member between the ages of 0 to 18. Now, what we need to understand is that adverse childhood experiences are common. They occur in clusters, and it's a strong predictor of later social functioning, well-being, health risk, disease, and death. If you've got an I score of 6 or more, your life expectancy is decreased by 20 years. And I don't even want to talk about high-risk behavior, because what they have found is that the people that experience the adverse childhood experiences, how it changed the brain architecture, and they then went into survival mode. So 4 more ACEs. The people had 4 or more times increased health risk for alcoholism, drug abuse, suicide, and more sexual partners. There's a strong correlation between higher ACE score and at-risk behavior. And if I bring it to the school, if I must bring that questionnaire to your school and ask children here already those questions, there's a link to a lower pass rate, high rate of school absenteeism, increased dropout, more suspensions, and decreased reading ability. Because if you're then in the part of your brain that shuts down when you can't learn, your reading is going to be affected. Now, they've done a study in South Africa that's not similar, but it shows us also the amount of violence. It's called the Birth to 20 cohort study in Johannesburg, Soweto. And they did a study on children that was born in that area in 1990, more than 2,000 children, 1,500 males and 1,600 females. And they assessed them on 22 occasions between the mother's pregnancy and when the children was 22 years of age. And 7 categories that they used: exposure to violence in the community, exposure to violence at home, at school, exposure to peer violence, direct experience of violence, direct experience of sexual violence, and whether you have perpetrated violence. Less than 1% had not experienced any violence in any of the categories. 36% experienced violence in all categories. And a greater portion of boys reported a score of 6. 96% of adolescents reported being victims of violence, and 40% of the children have been exposed to or experienced 5 or 6 of the categories. Now, I want to focus now a little bit on the trauma part, because what happens to your brain when you experience an adverse experience, especially as a child, is a signal comes into the bottom part of your brain. And say the child is now in danger at home, or the child is scared of the parent. A signal comes in and the child has a conversation with the parent, or something happens that scares the child, then immediately there's a hormone that's secreted in the brain called cortisol. Because we all then have a stress response. It makes your whole body sort of pull together to deal with this. The problem with trauma is, if that parent can't come, or an adult, like a teacher, can't come and soothe the child afterwards and say, it's okay, you can relax now, this is now over. That child never learns that the event is over. And what they have found with the adverse childhood experiences is that these children don't have safe caregivers that they can go to and soothe them afterwards. Now, a child doesn't learn how to regulate their own emotions and own impulses. They learn that from a calm caregiver. So the children that you have that come to you at school that have been traumatized at home on a chronic state, what it means is that their body and their whole system and their nervous system is in a high alert state. Because at home, it's a yelling and screaming and community violence the whole time. And no one comes and regulates and soothes that child. So for them, it's like the trauma is still continuing. They don't know that it stopped, and they don't know how to calm their own bodies down. We are all born with a stress response. And your caregivers help you to modulate that, help you to show that there is stress, but it's okay now. The question that we need to change in your school environment is not what is wrong with the children, but what has happened to them. Because what happens if we ask what is wrong with the children, we immediately want to pathologize them. And we're not thinking that this child is a brain that's formed by other people. And as a result of that, the behavior is what it is. Trauma is a psychologically distressing event that is outside the range of usual human experience, often involving a sense of intense fear, terror, or helplessness. And it sends that child into fight, flight, or freeze. And the children that you see, normally fight or flight has not worked, so they go in a frozen state. But when they come here, they want to fight or flight. We are all being shaped by our experiences. That's how the brain works. The brain is an experience-based organ. So if you look at the children that sit in front of you, the question that you need to ask yourself is, what relationships have been in this child's life, and how have that shaped this child to be the way that they are today? So developmental trauma is ongoing. It's early. It's from caregivers. So there's fear without safety. Toxic stress, there's no escape. And they are physically and emotionally overwhelmed, those kids. Think of trauma as a tap that drips non-stop. And that child can't escape from that. Complex trauma is like trauma on steroids, and that's what we see in our communities at the moment, especially the community violence. We see a generation of parents that's basically been born into trauma. The violence that's going on the Cape Flats. It's the experience of multiple or chronic and prolonged developmental adverse traumatic events, most often of a personal nature. The caregiver is supposed to be the child's thermostat. But what if you're working with children here who's got caregivers who are more traumatized than the children and more dysregulated than the children and cannot be their thermostat. Because it takes a calm adult to calm down the brain of a traumatized child. What happens here? So there's normally two scenarios that how we can respond to that baby is we go and we respond and the stress goes away and the baby feels that I matter, or no one responds to that child and the fear and the stress level of that child just escalates. Because your first caregiver is the first person that gives you the idea that I'm important, I matter. And when there's no response from their caregivers, those children go into survival mode. And the bottom part of the brain, even though it's called the brain stem, has got another name called the reptilian brain. Think about what does an animal do when they feel that they need to survive? They attack. That's what you see in the children that's experiencing complex trauma every day. So when children experience this kind of stress, their bodies remain in activation mode. And they can't determine anymore whether they see a real threat or perceived threat. And they're in a persistent state of alarm. Their stress response doesn't go back to normality, it stays aroused. And also because there's no parents or caregivers that can calm them down. So students who attend school, from preschool or educare through to high school, typically spend more than 13,000 hours of their developing brain's time in the presence of teachers. Now, if you just think of those amount of hours, you certainly have a role to play in shaping the brains and play an immense role in terms of how those children feel safe. Because we can't say anymore, well, you should be taught this at home, because the child might have parents that also didn't have good attachment. I'm going to skip some of the slides. What you see in children that experience trauma is that the brain goes into fight. They are oppositional, argumentative, stubborn, challenge authority, and they seem dangerous. Or they go in a fight mode, distracted, hyperactive, seeks attention, and they might flee or hide. Or they freeze. They may seem lazy, daydream as if they don't want to try, doesn't seem to care or stare off. Now this slide is very important because on your left-hand side is how the pyramid of our brain is supposed to look. 80% of our brain is supposed to be the part that's needed for you at school, for them to learn, the part that's responsible for cognitive development. But look what the pyramid looks like on the right-hand side when a child has experienced complex trauma. It means that the survival part of the brain, which is the bottom part of the brain, is bigger than the part that's responsible for learning and cognitive thoughts and decision making, which means that if you work with children who experience complex trauma and community trauma, the survival part of their brain is overactive and active most of the time. So what can you do about it, and what is the answer? Because the brain develops from the bottom upwards, you can't go and try and fix a child who's traumatized by pumping them full with, come, let's talk about this, let's reason about this, let's argue about this, try and give them a curriculum. Because it means that you're trying to fix the brain from the top down. Because the brain develops from the bottom upwards, you need to make an impact on this child's life from the bottom upwards. Which means that you need to go right back to the root of where the trauma started. And you almost need to go, if a child is 12, you need to go and see, have they received the attachment, how to regulate themselves? Can they be in a group? You literally need to go to the bottom part of the brain. And this is the answer. If your children can't feel safe with you, you're going to not be able to do anything with them. And we see it in therapy. Sometimes it takes me months before a client feels safe with me. They need to feel connected. They need to learn how to regulate their impulses so that the top part of their brain can come online and they can learn. Now, there's what they call a hand model of the brain. So if this is the brain stem, and you put your thumb there, and this is the middle part of the brain, which is responsible where your feelings are, and you fold your hand over your thumb here, and the front part here is the part that's responsible for your thinking and your cognitive part of your brain. So what happens when you experience trauma is they say you flip your lid. So this part goes up. So what happens here is you are run and governed then by what they call the subcortical part of your brain, or the part that's responsible for survival. And the only way that you can then help that child to become available, let's say, for learning, is by them feeling safe and you helping them to regulate their emotions. And that is done by things like rhythm or movement, because it's in their body, it's in their nervous system where that arousal lies that they can't control. But they need to be able to see you as a safe person first before that can happen. So for us to get all wound up and rallied up when a child seems out of control makes it worse, because that's what they see at home all the time. I'm going to end off with this, that a trauma-informed approach to discipline connects students to caring adult relationships. I do a 2 to 3 day trauma-informed schools training for schools, where I go into depth about how do you change your school to become a trauma-informed school. And all of that is about the fact that as you sit here in the hall today, you don't know each other's story. You don't know whom of you have experienced complex trauma, whom of you had safe relationships, whom of you don't have safe relationships, whom of you come from an environment now or have to go back home now where that bear is waiting for you. And have you worked through your trauma, and do you know what your triggers are so that you can regulate your own impulses? Because it's a calm brain that can be there with that child who throws the chair, who swears, and say, I hear you, I see you, what's happening? Not what's wrong with you, what's happening in your life? Because that behavior of that child is a message to you of where that child finds itself. So the fundamental principles of trauma-informed schools is to comprehend the prevalence and impact of trauma, that it's a perspective shift. It's using the relationships that you have to heal and build school connectedness. It is to build the capacity of the child's caregivers, not of the teachers, of the child's caregivers. And it's to look from point of departure where you can say to the child, I see the resilience in you. I can see that you have survived up till now. How did you do that? Use what they have done to turn it into something positive. If the gangs is the only thing they know, if the drugs is the only thing they know, don't suspend them for that. But we need to ask why. Why did they have to go that route to feel safe? I will send this to everyone, but I want to end off with this and say, these are the 5 stages of a trauma-informed school. And I'm not expecting the teachers to become therapists. But I need you to know that every child that comes and sits in your class have got a story, whether they're 5 years old or whether they're 20 years old. And unless you're going to take the time to, without judging, find out what their story is, and know that it's not that they don't want to, but they can't excel academically unless they feel safe with you and they've got a connection with you and they can learn from you that I don't have to shout and scream, I can wait. If I shout and scream, the teacher knows it's because if he is saying something today, I'm hearing my father off last night. Because if you're going to start making the attacks of the children that are experiencing trauma personal, that's when the burnout of teachers also starts happening. So I'm going to stop with this. Are there any questions? Okay, trauma-informed also means that this is not a solution that only lies with the school. A big part of this work is going to be in the community and with the parents, because unless the parents is going to understand their own trauma, like I had to go and understand my parents, nothing is going to change. What you basically can do at the moment is you need to build on your attachment and your connection with the child. But what I go into depth when I do the training is how do we set up a committee at school that's a trauma-informed committee that can go into that community and start with training around relationships and attachment and childhood adversity, how that affects the brain and how that has affected people's behavior. Because what I have found is your parents is going to sit with a lot of shame, so they don't want to come forward. They feel attacked. But once you explain to them that your brain has gone into survival mode because of all the cortisol that was pumping and you didn't get support from people when you were small, it brings an understanding and it can take away the shame. And then people start working with you as to how can I change my relationship with my child now, because it's never too late. But this is a multi-sector approach. It can't only be with the school. She's going to go more into the bullying, but that bully has also experienced adverse experiences.
I want to know if you have maybe any tips. If I think of my class of 30 learners, there are about 5 I can immediately say, well, they will probably tick 6 or more of those boxes. So they are in the same class. There's no way I can give that individual attention in the 8 hours or 6 hours of school. So do you have a tip, maybe how to cope with that in the limited time at school without letting that one child receive all your attention?
The only thing that I can really say to you is the thing that children miss that's experienced trauma, and especially then go into survival mode, is they don't know what it feels like to be in a safe relationship. So they're going to find it very strange initially if you maybe have a different way of greeting the children in the morning to make everyone feel important. But that's to start with that. I'm not saying that you need to now spend an hour on this child and 5 minutes on this child, but we need to find a way to make everyone in the class feel important and seen. And if that's 3 minutes of your morning, then that's it. It's about repetition and predictability. With little ones, what they've shown overseas in trauma-informed schools is that you have a way of greeting them at the door in the morning, and you sit on their level and you ask them, how do you want to be greeted? With a hug, a high five, and you look the child in the eye, because our brains develop with this kind of relationships where the neurons from the mother and the child, develop like that. Our brains are not made for the world as it is today. With technology and social media, our brains are not made for this world. We need to get back to this direct relationships. But if you can have a way of, in the morning, have a few minutes with the whole class where everyone feels the teacher is seeing me, I'm important, you will see a change eventually, because they're going to regard you as the only one that's really seeing me.
Claudia, you spoke about the brain, particularly in terms of rhythm and movement. Can you talk a bit more about the importance of rhythm and movement? And obviously now many of our schools, we don't have physical education as a major aspect of schoolwork. Can you talk a bit about that?
So, I've given away my age already in the beginning. When we were small, we did a lot of playing and learn through play and physical activity. It's not good for the brains of children to sit for 40 minutes or 50 minutes in a class, even high school children. So it's about how do you break the lesson and do things with rhythm and movement. So that they call it brain breakers, so that there's just that movement in between. What that also do is it regulates the nervous system, because remember, trauma is directly linked to your nervous system. So if I can't yell at home, or I have an opinion at home as a little girl and my father abused me, what happens to all that cortisol and stress hormones that get released? It go and gets stuck in your nervous system, especially if you can't express it or there's a mother that soothes you. Now that go and sit there, and it needs to get out somewhere. Or you are like a Coke bottle that if you open, the gas is everywhere, and that's how our traumatized children are. So the rhythm and the movement also regulates the nervous system. Also, what I suggest is they have overseas quite successfully formed what they call calm corners in their classrooms, even for high school. So that you work out with your class, a corner in your classroom where you put things that will calm that child down. So that child, when they feel that the escalation is becoming more, and I'm going to throw the chairs now, they go to that corner for 5 minutes, and maybe there's a bean bag, there's maybe some sensory things that they can touch that will just bring the nervous system re-regulated again. And that the children in your class with you talk about, what are the things that make me want to fight? What are the things that make me want to scream and break the doors? And how can you as a class work together to have things that if I feel like that, where do I go to in the class so that I can just calm down? So that the class become a safe environment for everyone in the class.
Maybe just add something quick. I once saw a lady battling with a 2-year-old getting a little car chair. And she was fighting that part. And the mother, you can see, she's now really worked out his life. How did you leave it? And eventually, another woman passed by and asked, what is happening? She said, I don't know, my child just flipped, and they said, I can't calm her down. And the first thing she asked her, where's the kid's toys? And she said, yeah. And she took 2 toys. And with that kid screaming, heck like it, she went to that kid and said, which one do you want to help? The moment that child's brain can activate to make a choice, it starts calming her down. And all of a sudden, she just calmed down. She said, I'm on that one. And the mother would just guide her. And all the problems were gone. There was some something triggering that child does not understand what is happening. It needs now to act out what there is no language for. But that ability not to judge, fight the child, just a simple question, was something that she can hold. Which story you want to know? And she made that, and she said, give me that one. The moment she had that toy in her arm, she quieted down.
Just to end off, I want to say the part of your brain, the top part of your brain that's responsible for learning is also the part where your speech center is situated. So if a child experiences complex trauma that's ongoing, that shuts off, that flips the lid, that's why children can't tell you what's happened. And they will only be able to tell you and have a narrative that makes sense when they feel safe with you and their nervous system can calm down. Because think about it, if there's now going to be shooting here, your body is going to react before your brain is going to tell you what's going on. And that's the same with children that's experiencing complex and continuous toxic stress. Is their bodies hold that the whole time and their bodies respond the whole time, their nervous system. That's what you need to get to calm down before you're going to be able to have a conversation with them. Thank you. I'm available for anyone afterwards as well.